This as a paint-along course. If you focus too much on the specific colors or brushstrokes that I'm using, you might miss out on the overall technique I'm demonstrating. The forest might get lost for the trees. After all, I don't want you to learn how to make my paintings. I want you to learn how to make your paintings. So my preference is that you watch the lessons without a brush in your hand first, and then try to apply those techniques yourself with your own reference material. After we learn how to create strong foundations for your paintings, we'll move on to strategies for creating convincing details. I'll provide concrete guidance on how to approach some of the more common things you may encounter, such as water, mountains, architecture, portraits, and more. We'll finish up the last few lessons by talking about creative strategies to help you have fun with the new skills you're learning. By the time you finish this course, you'll be confident and comfortable painting whatever it is you wish to paint, expressing yourself and your ideas in whatever style that speaks to you. But first things first, let's talk about what you need to set yourself up for success. Contrary to what you might have heard, you don't need a lot of expensive paints and brushes to make great art. You can paint on almost any surface you find: wood, glass, plastic, metal, canvas, or even strange objects you find at the thrift store, which happens to be one of my favorites. In this course, we'll be focusing on panel and canvas. As we move through the exercises, experiment with different tools and materials, find the best ones for you and your style of working. I'll advise you along the way, but finding your own preferences will free you up to focus on being creative. What about painting space? Do you need a studio to make a great painting? Of course not. But you do want to keep some things in mind as you choose your space. You probably have an image in your mind of a painter sitting at an easel, and an easel is certainly an option, but not necessary. I will be painting on an easel in this course, but I actually prefer working on the wall in my own studio. I have much more wall space than I do easels, and I like to work on at least 5 paintings at a time. You just need a sturdy spot to hang or sit your canvas, and that you can sit or stand in front of, whatever's most comfortable for you. So keep that in mind as you choose your space. You'll also want to choose a space with plenty of light if you can. The more light you have in your studio, the more clearly you'll be able to see your colors. But again, there are options. If you don't have a window nearby, a few clamp lights that you can position onto your canvas will do the job. Do keep in mind that artificial lights will vary in color, and that will influence how your painting looks. Also keep flooring in mind. Even if you're super careful with your brush strokes, a drop brush or palette can do a number on your floor. Either choose a space with a floor that can eventually look like a Jackson Pollock painting, or invest in a drop cloth or a tarp. Once you have your space set up, it's time to do some material shopping. This can be overwhelming and an expensive experience, but it doesn't have to be. Almost everything you need to get started you can find at your local craft store. And there's no need to go for the high-end material first. Start simply and see what works for you. First, brushes. There are 2 basic types: bristle brushes with thicker hairs that create more textural strokes, and sable type brushes that have finer hairs and make smoother marks. Both types come in natural and synthetic. The synthetics are cheaper, and that's what I usually go for since I'm not very kind to my brushes. They're a good place to start, and they're good for both oils and acrylics. You want to get a good variety of shapes and sizes. Flats are good for straight lines, hard edges, geometric shapes, architecture, and perspective. Rounds are good for curvilinear lines, things like clouds, trees, organic shapes, movement, and water. If you want a flat and a round and can't commit to either one, filberts are kind of a mix between the two. They're pinched flat like flats, but have a rounded top. A good beginner's kit of synthetic brushes should include a variety of rounds and flats in a range of sizes. This should work fine for getting started. Brights are brushes with short bristles for dabbing paint. I've never bought any brights because all of my old brushes end up looking like that anyway. But if you want to paint like Seurat, you should grab some of those. Fan brushes are fun for blending, so if you really need super soft transitions, you might consider one of these, but they aren't necessary. There are a bunch of other types of brushes. If you see something that looks interesting to you, give it a try. However, you can make a great painting with a single cheap old brush if that's what you have on hand. In fact, some of the most interesting marks aren't made with brushes. You can use your hand, a credit card, a plastic bag, an empty box of Pop-Tarts. It's fun to experiment because each different thing you pick up is going to give you a different mark and a different type of texture. Moving on to paints. Deciding on oil paint, acrylic paint, or watercolor paint depends on what you want to achieve. I'm a huge fan of acrylic paint for how versatile it is. But for a classical look, you want to use oil paint for rich, luscious, oily texture and smooth blends. I will be using mainly acrylics in this course, but we do have a couple of lessons devoted to oils. For our projects, I suggest getting a decent set of acrylics in a reasonable color range. I've included a list of recommended colors in the guidebook, and I'll also be showing you tricks for mixing almost any color you want. I've also included a list of oils you'll want to get if you want to experiment with our oil projects later in the course. Watercolor is a different kind of paint than oil or acrylic. The pigments are suspended in gum arabic and thus behaves a bit differently. Watercolor is a totally different style of painting than oil and acrylic, using a different approach, different surfaces, and different techniques. Watercolor deserves its own in-depth study. With so much to cover, we'll be sticking to acrylic and oil for this course, but we will be looking at some cool ways to get very convincing watercolor effects with acrylic paint. Beyond paints and brushes, what other materials do you need? You want a palette that makes it easy to access all your colors and blend them together. Plastic palettes work well for acrylic. Wood or primed wood palettes are good for oil. Many people like to use glass as well for an oil palette, as it's easy to scrape off. In order to have a clean palette to show you my colors and mixing, I'm going to be using a disposable paper palette. These are handy, but obviously create more waste. If you don't have a palette, any old plate will do, even a paper plate. You just want it large enough to put about 6 to 10 colors on it and have room to mix them. You'll also want a few cups that you can put water in for acrylic. At the minimum, I like to have 2 cups, one for color paint and one for white and clear mediums. You can have as many as you want though. For oil, you'll want a container for linseed oil and a container with a lid for your solvents. We'll get into these materials and their safety precautions when we move into oils later in the course. You'll want to have a rag or an old t-shirt handy to clean your brushes, not only for when you're cleaning up, but when you're switching colors with the same brush. Otherwise, your paint will start to get muddy really quick. A palette knife is very handy to have on hand. You can mix paint with it, apply paint with it, or smooth out your gel mediums with it. They come in many different sizes and shapes. Lately, I've been using a larger one with a flat edge to cover larger surfaces. I also like to use a smaller, pointier one to make marks on the canvas or scratch into the paint like a drawing tool. I also suggest that you have a sketchbook and pencil on hand to use as we work on compositions. Don't worry, no advanced drawing skills will be required. Finally, we'll be using a few common household items like rulers and masking tape as we move into the later lessons. If anything unusual is needed for an exercise, it will be noted in the reference material for the lesson. Our first exercise is a simple but important one. All you'll need for it is a brush or two of your choosing, an acrylic paint of any color that strikes your fancy, and a somewhat roomy surface to paint on. A 16 by 20 factory canvas from the craft store would do, but a large paper surface, like an office flip pad, would also work. Most importantly, you'll need a willingness to let your preconceptions about painting go. Ready? Good. Let's get painting. My first painting teacher, Hyung-Mi Lee, completely changed my approach and understanding of painting.